So this graph shows Adobe's stock performance from its initial public offering in 1986 up until 2013. This already tells some interesting stories, such as the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s in the middle of the graph, its subsequent bust, and then steady growth until the sharp decline caused by the global financial crisis in 2008. It did stabilize, but then remained neither here nor there for several years. In 2013, though, things started changing. Adobe announced they would no longer sell individual copies of any of their products, but would bundle them into a subscription-based service called Adobe Creative Cloud, charged as a monthly or annual fee. If you were a graphic designer, you were probably just expropriated, as Marx might say. Your means of production were taken from you and you had to pay rent to continue your work. You can probably guess what happens next to Adobe's stock price. From 2013 until 2019, Adobe's stock increased eightfold, having locked its users into its software as a service regime. Having no competitors with anywhere near the same resources and capital, Adobe had successfully monopolized digital, visual, and graphic cultural production, and it was making a fortune on rent. But this was not their endgame. They had greater ambitions. Adobe started to brand itself as not just the market leader of the means of cultural production, it wanted to rebrand as the market leader of creativity. This is an important shift. At a conference in 2019, CEO Shantanu Narayan took to the stage for his keynote address, explaining the company's new direction. What happened there?
I truly believe that we're in the golden age of creativity. Storytelling has never been more rich, thanks to the innate desire to communicate and the power that we have today with digital technology. It is the foundation of arts, of culture. It's critical to education and entertainment. And it powers societal change as well as drives economic progress and breakthroughs. Because it doesn't matter if you're a designer, an engineer, a student, or a business owner. Creativity today is a fundamental skill.
So to roll out this new golden age of creativity, they rolled out several initiatives, including branding targeted at young affluents, calling them Generation Create. They stepped up sponsorships with museums and galleries, including several attempts to turn them into metaverse spectacles. You can probably guess how that went. All the while, they were targeting business, rolling out online tests that claimed to assess what they called the creativity quotient, or CQ, of your business, with the idea that a creative business is an agile, innovative, and prosperous business regardless of what it actually sells. Of course, a pandemic happened a few months later, and 1 billion people were suddenly confined to their own home trying to find new ways to pass the time and be productive. So let's return to the graph. Are we living in the golden age of creativity? Let's look at the graph until November 2021. We are, hooray. But whose golden age is this? Obviously. Is this the golden age of creativity, or is it the golden age of the means of creativity, of creative software? If we're in a golden age of creativity, why are so many culture workers so miserable? Now, before we jump to conclusions, you may have heard me say November 2021, because what happened after that was a bit of a shuffle. The picture complicates a little bit. The market sold off crash of the tech industry in late 2021, early 2022, at this so-called end of the COVID pandemic. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost. Adobe made back some of its ground, but it speaks to the volatility of this moment that might have once been called the golden age of creativity. Anyway, I'd like to just start by dwelling on this epithet of the golden age of creativity. It's obviously a marketing gimmick, but I think it's instructive in telling us how global capital, and in particular Silicon Valley, understand creativity. It wants you to believe that creativity, and as I'll argue later, expression, is the elevated practice of individual liberation as long as you pay the rent, while culture is little more than a lucrative hobby. So I want to put this in dialogue with a well-known proverb that originates in California. In a gold rush, don't mine for gold, sell picks and shovels. This proverb dates to just after the Californian gold rushes of 1849 to 55, when it was understood as a safer enterprise to invest in selling picks and shovels to the 100,000 prospectors who migrated to California, rather than the high-risk, high-reward strategy of actually mining for gold. This is just capitalism, of course, but those prospectors in the gold rushes were very poor and they weren't parting with what little money they had lightly. They had to be sold on the idea. The idea here is simple. You, a rational individual, have control of your destiny. You can strike gold and you can escape poverty if you have the right tools. Even if the likelihood of striking gold is basically a rounding error, this is a very, very powerful state of mind that applies absolutely, I believe, to creatives today in this golden age of creativity. A powerful state of mind, but powerful for whom? Foucault suggests a word for this, subjectification. Now, I know, I imagine you, but here I mean two things here. One, a clear pattern of domination and exploitation, where one group of the king's subjects, of which for some reason I am. And two, the way this class shifts their subjectivity, their way of knowing the world, to not just accommodate this domination, but to sustain it. As an example, I've given Lauren Berlant's excellent book, Cruel Optimism, and they write about how we believe that, for example, working hard will be rewarded with upward social mobility. But the illusion of this belief is a deliberate feature of capitalist life. So what if we understand creativity as subjectification, as a kind of enthusiastic exploitation? Now, I'm obviously not the first person to suggest this, and I would recommend Be Creative by Angela McRobbie and The Invention of Creativity by Andreas Reckwitz. I don't want to go into too much depth because of time, but they are essential books, and the idea of the creative subject is a very fertile one, but they're missing something from their analysis. The nitty-gritty, day-to-day material practices of culture workers, especially those working with digital tools. There are many reasons, I think, why these tools have escaped large-scale academic analysis. And Fred and I believe that there aren't very many, if any, attempts to understand these software practices on an interdisciplinary scale. So that is why that's sort of the manifesto of the book, is just to kind of start this process. So most scholars of cultural production focus on the means of cultural distribution, such as Spotify, Netflix, and Amazon. These are important objects to critique, of course, and they do produce culture in a way, but it seems that the software that we use every day to actually make culture has been left behind, at least from analysis. The digital audio workstations, image editors, video editors, animators, game engines, middleware, plugins, computer-assisted design tools, presentation programs, word processors, and so on. So yeah, I guess the main thesis of the book is this. If being creative is a subjectification or an index of power, then one way this power is expressed is through these tools. The challenge then is theorizing broadly in a way that doesn't exclude any disciplines of cultural production, while retaining the diversity of vocabulary and techniques for adopting or resisting software's encroachment into these disciplines. In the intro to the book, Fred and I suggest a good starting place, as well as this idea of the creative subject, is with Silicon Valley ideology. So since the 1960s, tech developers have considered the vast creative potential of the computer. They coined terms like metamedium to describe how, given enough power, a computer could act like any communication medium, like music or film. This has since been given the admittedly pretty clunky name, softwarization. Making software to subsume their traditional means of production, but not because they wanted to colonize it or take over these art forms or even to act nefariously in any way, but because they thought it would bring about artistic liberation. Of course, whether it actually does liberate nowadays is an open question, and I think we can talk about it at the end. So these two contexts sort of inform the bulk of the introduction. I'm just going to show the contents page really quick. So I love all chapters, and Catherine will obviously talk about hers soon. I guess a highlight for me would be, I really love Tom Livingston's chapter on the spatial languages of virtual production and in-camera visual effects. Seth Scott wrote an excellent one on Dolby Atmos and like the risk that it puts onto culture workers. And yeah, there's lots of great chapters here. There's a link in the Zoom chat to look into the work if you like. So yeah, that's sort of the introduction, kind of really glossed over. I'd like to talk about my chapter now on the expressive subject. And before that, I would like to give some personal context. So, uh, in 2019, I wrote a PhD called The Grain of the Digital Audio Workstation. It was kind of inspired by Roland Barthes' essay, The Grain of the Voice, and trying to kind of investigate compositional practice that really foregrounded the sort of material reality of the DAW. And I suppose I initially went into it thinking of trying to understand it and its interface via kind of frameworks developed in the KNIME community, of which many of you here are members. But it quickly became more about understanding the DAW as like a unique bundle of social and cultural forces with material consequences for cultural production writ large. Over the next few years, I was asked to write some magazine articles and stuff, and one of them was the hegemony of the DAW, in which I could be a bit more polemic and a bit more op-ed-like. And I wrote things like, the DAW's ascendancy is a tale of the deregulation of musical labor and the atomization of music culture. In some ways, the DAW replaced the piano as the primary site of solitary musical expression. Music creation ever since has never been so lonely. And then I followed that up with a foray into journalism, I suppose, with an article called Plug-in Capitalism, in which I was reporting on increasing venture capital interest in the plug-in industry, specifically Native Instruments and Isotope, who were kind of bought out by Francisco Partners, who are a massive VC firm, for 600 million euros or something like that, a very big number, and how platformization and how these elements of financialization are in some ways built into the interface, or you can kind of understand how VC firms would find them in compelling investments. So these articles, I guess they had a bit of traction and they got some really funny responses. I obviously written by an American in my life. It's just on my Facebook page. But the positive response was pretty overwhelming, and I think it's contributed to a lot of popular analysis in a slightly less academic sense of DAWs and their kind of cultural and social effect. So Ableton wrote researchers at Ableton wrote a paper called The Other Hegemony, talking about similar issues. YouTubers like Ben Jordan were talking about kind of restating a lot of the arguments I made in Plug-in Capitalism. And a lot of people are thinking a lot more about this, especially as generative AI threatens the kind of supremacy of the DAW. This is around the time when I realized this is a bigger issue than music, yet I didn't really know what other disciplines were doing. Like, I really wanted to keep going, but I just needed more context about softwarization. And that's when I started looking into like critical writing around Photoshop, and like the legend of critical writing about Photoshop is Frédérik Lesage. I highly recommend all of his papers. He's a fantastic writer. And yeah, so I reached out to him, and that began this 2.5-year process of putting this book together. Anyway, I knew that for my chapter, I wanted to write about MIDI controllers. So I'm a lapsed classical pianist myself, and I've spent long periods of my life either trying to bring like the expressive capacity of a grand piano to electronic music, and similarly long periods in opposition to it. And it's a common anxiety, I think, in electronic electronic music. I'm sure many here can relate. So I wanted to start by showing a funny video of just someone who clearly has expression all worked out. He's solved it. This is Italian performer Marco Parisi performing Prince's Purple Rain on a MIDI controller called the Seaboard, made by the company ROLI. Etc. So if there is such a thing as a creative subject, as I argue, then I suggest there's a variation called an expressive subject. Or biopolitics invites us to consider how our desire for expressive connection is being exploited and commoditized. Expressive subjects are creative subjects, but they're also consumers or prosumers, willing to spend big to achieve their expressive potential. I know like classical musicians who spend tens of thousands of dollars on their instrument, for example. Um, Musical expression is usually talked about in terms of technique and mastery, virtuosity, emotionality, and artistic craftsmanship, but it's pretty rarely talked about as consumerism. So in the same way that Adobe is trying to produce expressive subjects, music tech companies are in the business of producing expressive subjects. The widespread idea that the computer mouse and keyboard are not musically expressive tools is a social construct that draws, understandably, on centuries of musical performance tradition. This opens up a market, or a problem that is solved by the market, through MIDI controllers. As I'm sure you know, they're almost always cheap, cheaply made, and they break easily, either due to hardware faults or becoming redundant with software updates. They don't exactly inspire you to learn them, to invest time into them, as if they were instruments with expressive potential. Enter Roland Lamb. So as a design student, Roland Lamb and others envisioned a special MIDI controller, a piano with a squishy surface that you could push your fingers into and swipe around, and the pressure of these gestures would control music. He published a paper at the 2011 NIME conference describing the prototype and design philosophy. This effectively launched his company ROLI, which he named after himself, but the name Roland was already taken. Just 2 years later, famous musicians like Hans Zimmer, Stevie Wonder, and Grimes are seen playing them, with pundits calling it the piano of the future. ROLI began aggressively expanding, accruing a significant war chest of venture capital funding. So the first family of products they released with all of this VC money flowing in was a family of products called blocks. These are small modular devices with various methods of control, including their famous Seaboard design in a smaller form, and pressure-sensitive pads and control blocks with various practical functions. The idea behind it was basically that you, the expressive subject, would grow the instrument with you. I have a tech demo, but I'm just going to show like 10 seconds of it and move on because of time.
ROLI blocks. Build your system, customize your setup, and express your sound,
etc. So I suggest in the article that the expressive subject that ROLI is creating here is a prosumer by accumulation. What does this mean? The accumulation of products is the thing that is expressive, not the music. This expressive subjectivity is a major part of the music industry and can explain the consumerism around things like guitar pedals, modular synths, drum kits, and plugins used in a DAW. There's even a syndrome for this called gear acquisition syndrome, or GAS, which I'm sure you're aware of. Or if not, maybe you've read Herbst and Menz's book on GAS. Recommend that. More to say about it, but I'll move on. This strategy didn't really work for ROLI, however. There are several fatal design flaws in the making of this thing that would look pretty amazing to a private equity investor who had never made music, but that was the problem. It was not very practical to most modern musicians. Future Music reviewed the blocks, giving them a rating of 70%, which is a scathing grade from the usually very sycophantic music technology press. And they said, if I was ROLI CEO Roland Lamb, I would take a good hard look in the mirror and make some serious changes. Things went up and down and down and down, and then ROLI entered voluntary administration in 2021. They briefly rebranded as Luminary, and their sole product was this for learning keyboard on the iPad, which they called Peloton for piano, a few weeks before Peloton's stock price crashed by something like 80%. But they found new VC funding, and they renewed the ROLI brand, and they announced that they would focus on updating and maintaining the Seaboard as their primary instrument. Roland Lamb said, we were ahead of our time when he talks about the bankruptcy. ROLI were now in the business of producing instruments capable of virtuosic performance. They want to engender meaningful, sustained, expressive connections with their instruments to attract performers willing to deeply invest the time to learn the instrument. In other words, they're aiming to produce expressive subjects. Now, ROLI have a very active YouTube page promoting the Seaboard and videos of many young musicians who've developed pretty remarkable skill with the controller. I'm not going to play this video because I want to try and minimize your Hans Zimmer exposure if I can, etc. That's all we get. So in almost every video on ROLI's YouTube page, the performer the expressive subject is playing by themselves, and it's almost always a man, to a backing track. These subjects are often social media influences as well, making music as a primarily audiovisual spectacle. To me, it's the epitome of isolation, of an antiquated idea of expression as an individual in total control of his instrument. It's a condition that speaks to the precarious labor of legitimizing new musical instruments as such. Precarious both aesthetically, as you're developing new techniques that might not catch on, and financially, you're spending a lot of time and labor learning this instrument that may or may not kind of pay off for your creative career. Both the Seaboard and the blocks, these two case studies, aim to provide a technological solution to the problem of musical expression. But music expression is not a technological problem with a technological solution. I argue that it is a social apparatus. I think it's an infrastructure, a dispositif in Foucault's words, that promotes affiliation between one abstract sign and another. The correlation between some expressive technique and some emotional state is never a priori and takes time and cultural momentum to establish. So to describe this, consider the Roland TR-808 and the Roland TB-303. These instruments are not expressive in any traditional musical sense. You don't have too many methods to control them. There's no capacity for rubato or any of these forms typical of classical expression. But they're today considered quite expressive instruments or very auratic instruments. Why? They were used by musicians, typically African-American musicians, at a time when the aesthetics of electronic music were in their infancy and Black musicians were exploring them in exciting ways. Marvin Gaye and Afrika Bambaataa used the 808 in ways that effectively made it sexy by affiliation, while the electronic musicians who used the 303 in a way very much unintended by Roland made sounds that were so far out there that it birthed the whole genre of acid techno. Now these instruments sell for 10 to 20 times their initial asking price. Nothing changed about their materiality or affordances as technologies, only the social apparatus. So I think this is kind of what expressive subjectification means, at least in this virtuoso sense. What ROLI is trying to seek is trying to get people to do the work that these innovative musicians were doing with the 808 and the 303, of making them sexy by affiliation, of kind of tying them to innovation, to perform the aesthetic labor of rendering them expressive by affiliation. Okay, so I'll conclude by summarizing the main points, and that'll be it. So, music researchers have a lot more to learn about software through its handling in other disciplines. I hope this book is a good first step on that front. Music researchers need to be mindful of musical exceptionalism in matters of software and HCI. Something I've really come around to in the process of making this is that music has a way of making all its own terms for things that media theory and cultural studies and visual art studies have had words for a longer time. And I think that's unnecessary sometimes, and interdisciplinary dialogue can help to establish ways to kind of deal with aesthetic commonalities together. The emergence of creative software can be historically contextualized through the creative subjectification concept that I've talked about and Silicon Valley ideology. Thinking of expression in terms of power can wrest it away from traps like technological determinism and musical exceptionalism. And my two case studies, prosumers by accumulation, and then my other concept, music tech companies hope to produce virtuosi who can do the precarious work of musically legitimizing their product. And I guess my final provocation is that expression is social, is not quite as relevant, because expression is always just going to be a communication involving some material sign of some sort or another. I'll leave that thought as a prompt or a provocation at our discussion at the end. Otherwise, that is it from me. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll stop sharing.
Amazing. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's a very rich, full talk, full of a lot of things that I think we could probably dive into. So I think we have about 5 minutes of questions. But as noted, Michael has put his, or will put his email or some contact details if you want to follow up any of this with him. But does anyone have an immediate question for Michael? Or is it just me with a list of questions? You can put your hand up. It's under the React thing these days in Zoom. Under React, there's raise hand, and you can come on and ask the question directly, or you can put it in the chat as you prefer. Otherwise, I'm gonna kick us off with one.
Please.
I'm trying to pick which one I want to start with. I thought maybe one that I had some sort of pre-planned, but one that came up there right at the end was this idea of musical exceptionalism and making up all their own terminology for things. Partly because we've often framed this network and a lot of the work we do as being like, it's slightly directed at the HCI world and saying like, aha, no, this works for you maybe, but in this domain of music, no, you don't know what you're talking about. We do like kind of use that exceptionalism a lot. So I wondered if you had any specific examples there or wanted to say more about that.
I think my example of musical exceptionalism really rests on expression as a concept. Not many other art forms really take expression seriously, or at least, or it's kind of, maybe it's a bit gauche to talk about it in the visual arts. Whereas I find, I mean, I confess to reading a lot of NIME work during my PhD and not much since, so maybe things have changed a bit around just the reception of ideas like expression. But these are very, very difficult concepts, and they're kind of assumed to be these quite classical positions. There's a great Jonathan Stern article called Spectral Objects, which maybe some of you have read, like all about really quizzing why people have these very classical, conservative in a way notions of what expression ought to be in instrument design. And so that is my main example. But, you know, it's obviously super important for musicians to talk with tech people, with devs and tech, and just say, actually, musicians do it like this. I think that's super important. I have no issue with that. And the more musicians are involved in the decisions that will probably affect their livelihoods, then I think that's a fantastic thing to do.
Yeah, okay, that clarifies it a lot. I think there has been sort of various reckonings with the term expression in the NIME kind of discourse. Like there's a Gurevich and Trevino article is the one I'm thinking, Expression and its Discontents, which was the first one I saw that really tried to paint a more nuanced picture of things. But it is like, I took a lot from your chapter because it made a lot of sense in the way it presented the idea of expression. I had myself a whole folder of what I thought were hilarious presentations of expression in ROLI promotional material. Just the way they present it felt so incongruous to my understanding of it. And I mean, you put that into words very eloquently, I thought.
It's the classic like Moog versus Buchla like discourse, where Moog became the popular one because they put the keyboard on the synth. And I think Trevor Pinch's book about and all of his writing about that is super interesting, and I just felt like that was playing out all over again with ROLI. And I guess in some ways it works, or at least it appeals to VC people, because he's Roland Lamb is incredibly gifted at getting funding, and I think that's an underrated skill, not one that I would have any experience of, but yeah.
Does anyone else want to ask some questions here? Again, via the chat. Oh, yep. Oh, Siddharth. Yep.
Hello there. It was really, really fascinating talk. Thank you for that. I just wanted to ask like a kind of combined question. I was wondering, for example, you talked about for Unreal Engine, for example, and just recently they talk about how like tech people need to talk with musicians. Like, for example, engine kind of sounds very industrial, I think, while the whole point of creativity is not kind of tech. So I was thinking the whole like ROLI recently announced this motion and MIDI, motion to MIDI sensors. And do you think that it creates an environment and musicians are stuck in that environment and kind of cannot escape it? Like, it's not like, because if someone doesn't know tech, you cannot change the API of ROLI, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the whole blocks ecosystem, I think the point of it in a way was to kind of lock people into an ecosystem where you sort of had to buy your way into making it functional, because you can't just, I don't know, maybe you could perform with just one of those little blocks, but I guess that figures into ROLI's business plan of just making these ecosystems to trap people in, or I mean, I'm being a bit harsh on ROLI. A friend of mine used to work for ROLI, and they did lots of really good work in kind of promoting MPE and doing a lot of the MIDI 2.0 programming and stuff. So I'm not entirely critical of them, and I'd actually quite like to have a Seaboard, but yeah, I mean, in terms of like Unreal Engine and like the metaphors there. That's a super interesting one that I talk about in the introduction a bit. Like, you know, say like in architecture, it would have, you know, computer-assisted design tools, whereas in you have musical instruments and then game engines, and these all signify different kinds of work. And I haven't really looked into the kind of etymology of these metaphors and why game engine worked the way it was. Maybe there's just this kind of there's a gender, a mask element to game engine or game dev work. But I'm working on a project at the moment with a VR and sound and dance project where I'm putting sounds into Unreal with MIDI, but using MIDI, and there's like a live dancer as well. It's a crazy project, but I think that is a really fascinating kind of, maybe that's a future thing where it's just like, you know, that is that kind of project where lots of disciplines are really kind of coming together in a really messy way. And Unreal Engine is the engine behind it all, and it's a beast. It's and like the internal politics around Unreal Engine and like its you know, store presences and just like the kind of the enshittification, now that that's a very big buzzword, of the platform, is very interesting. I'm not sure if I answered your question or just 5 questions adjacent to the question, but
No, for sure. I think, yeah, in the future, what I kind of think is like people will open source these things at some point. They will have to, because they will have competitors. And once you have a bit of open source, you get much more, I guess, creative freedom to do whatever you want.
right. Yeah. Yeah, fair enough.